Finally, we get to see Zoro versus Rob Lucci. You know, technically this is a rematch from Water 7, and this is something that I didn't quite appreciate until much later after I'd read the chapter. But Zoro did very briefly fight Lucci on Water 7, and the way that Lucci disposed of Zoro was by kicking him out of the building. So I do love that on Egghead Island, Zoro's solution with Lucci is to get a bit of payback by sending him flying through a building as well. And it's one of those moments where you really see how far we've come. On Water 7, CP9, especially Rob Lucci, seemed insurmountable. But now on Egghead Island, Zoro is the one who is insurmountable to Lucci. I mean, I took a poll after the chapter, and I feel like I posted a poll that only had one option because the majorific number of Grand Fleet members said that Zoro was going to win. And not only that, in the comments, most made it clear that this wasn't even a contest. But I don't know if it's that simple. To be clear, I love Zoro as much as any reasonable person, which is of course a lot and more than Sanji. But Lucci is such a tricksy character. Going in his favor, Lucci is an awakened devil fruit user, which crazily enough is somehow a step up from King, Queen, and potentially even Kaido. And you know what? It still strikes me as odd that in the Zoan fruit arc, the only Zoan awakening we saw was a Paramecia fruit. That aside, Lucci isn't an honorable opponent. He's not going to fight for the sport of it. He's very smart, and at times Zoro can be very not that. So I can see a situation where Lucci is able to exploit Zoro, despite Zoro being overwhelmingly more powerful. But in Zoro's favor, he's Zoro, and I imagine that Saint Saturn, hearing the future report of what happens to Lucci, will go something like this.
Oh, how awful. Did he at least die painlessly? To shreds, you say?
And if you're one of the 96% of Zoro supremacists out there, then you can now show your voracious support in real life with a Sword Tiger shirt from storeglr.com. It's a premium shirt made with super special tri-blend fabric and designed by one of our wonderful channel artists. I mean, what are you even doing right now? I bet that you're standing, sitting, or lying there with some sort of standard body covering. Don't do that. Those are for people who suck. And you don't suck, do you? If you're not into Sword Tigers, we also have plenty of other options: dogs, cats, birds, bears, and crocodiles, to name but a few, all available through the link in the description, which is storeglr.com, the shop place that supports the channel place that supports your crippling addiction to fictional pirate content. So do that thing, but now let's get back to the imminent demise of Rob Lucci. Lucci absolutely has to get bodied by Kizaru after hyping up their friendship. And yeah, it was a bit like my dad can beat up your dad. And while friendship is a strong word, I do agree with the sentiment here. Lucci is definitely overplaying his importance right now, and here's why. The thing is, in this chapter, Kizaru made his priorities very clear. There are only 3 things he's interested in. He needs to save York, he needs to save the Mother Flame production, and he needs to save Punk Records. Everything else is disposable, and Rob Lucci, very notably, is part of the everything else, as is Kaku and the other Cypher Pol agents. Kizaru would not hesitate in the slightest to dispose of all of them if it furthered his actual goals. Again though, I'm definitely not writing Lucci off. I mean, in straight up combat, it would be a complete wash, and that's particularly bad for Lucci because of how much cats hate water, but it probably won't be straight up combat. I just have a feeling that he's gonna go off and pull some sneaky shenaniganry and end up being quite problematic. And there might even be a situation where Lucci manages to escape from Zoro and double teams Luffy with Kizaru, sort of like how Guernica snuck into the fight against Kaido. Kizaru saying the Straw Hats are nostalgic is incredibly horrifying. Great dialogue. Horrifying it's the right word, because Egghead Island has had some nice horror mystery vibes that were going on earlier, and to me, those vibes have made a big comeback with Kizaru's appearance. Sabadi Archipelago was probably the biggest hit that we take in the series. I mean, yes, arguably Ace's death and Luffy's post-war trauma were more emotionally raw, but they were pure tragedy, whereas Sabadi was genuinely horrific. You've got the Straw Hats being pursued by a monster that they have no chance of defeating whatsoever. You know, it's like running from Slender Man in the woods. And just like a horror movie, the crew gets picked off one by one. And to Kizaru, this was just a pleasant stroll through the archipelago, which makes him a very sinister villain. And it also implies that he took some enjoyment from this act, which I guess shouldn't be too surprising, but he's very hard to read, so most of Kizaru's actions tend to come off as neutral. Oftentimes, I feel like he's not even too sure what he's doing, he only knows why, because he was told to. So having him become so lucid and indicate that he does take some kind of enjoyment is, well, that's pretty scary, because because he's operating less on blind loyalty and more on the spectrum of doing bad things for the personal pleasure, much like a certain Rob Lucci does, but to a lesser degree. Or who knows, maybe even to a larger degree. Maybe Kizaru is a sadistic and it gives a bit of new context to his offer to go to Wano and handle Big Mom and Kaido, which is still one of the most insane things that any character has ever said in the series. But if Kizaru was something of a combat junkie, then I can see why that would be an appealing idea. And at the very least, we know that he's confident enough to take on an emperor. So facing off against Luffy is no big deal. Or is it? Something that's really only apparent in the Japanese text is that Kizaru is taking this moment uncharacteristically seriously. This is because Kizaru has a habit of speaking in elongated sentences. If you're familiar with the anime, then you'll probably remember him speaking a lot like this, which is represented in Japanese by these delightful squiggles. But in this chapter, there were no squiggles to be had when Luffy kicks him, which is interesting because against Marco, Kizaru was still taking things pretty easily. So at the very least, Kizaru is slightly less relaxed after tanking Luffy's kick. So on a scale of 1 to complete incontinence, I would say that Kizaru's rectum is ever so slightly clenched in sheer surprise. And on the flip side, Luffy is much more relaxed. On Sabaody, he was the victim of the horror movie, but now Luffy's acting like he's the killer. So it's becoming a very interesting role reversal. And just as a side note, this is the first time we've seen an emperor take on an admiral since the Paramount War. So as far as global impact goes, this is a pretty monumental moment for the world, which will no doubt be mercilessly farmed by birds to sell newspapers. And as a side note, and I guess as a side note, I was thinking about this recently, but whatever happened to Kizaru's jaunty hat? Seeing Bogart so much in the live action made me remember that Kizaru once had a very similar style. And I guess my headcanon for why he stopped wearing it is because it kept falling off his head while he was traveling at the speed of light. But I miss it. I like the hat. The two wings doing their respective job without missing a beat was great to see. Yes, it wasn't as overt as during the raid, but in Luffy's absence, Zoro and Sanji just got the job done. A problem arose and they solved it. And not only that, but they solved it with perfect unspoken teamwork. In my initial review, I did question Sanji's composure because it was Stussy that got injured, and due to the femininity of said Stussy, I feel like in this situation, Sanji would have that burning desire to be the one to deliver justice to Lucci. But I do think this just shows how much both Zoro and Sanji have grown. Sanji is able to put those base feelings in check and selects the best course of action, which makes the best use of both of their respective skills. There's no arguing over who gets to do what, they both just instinctively know, which is something they've always had access to. Going back to Long Ring Long Land, when Zoro and Sanji did put their differences aside for exactly 10 seconds, their teamwork instantly solved the problem. And together, I think they're a more effective team than say Zoro and Luffy, because Zoro and Sanji have completely different skill sets that fill the gaps of the other. Like guns, Sanji used a gun in this chapter, which was fun. I don't know if fun is the right word, but it did remind me of his original design where he was supposed to be a suave gunslinger, although he has used a gun in the past. During Whiskey Peak, Sanji did point a gun at Robin, which is very interesting in retrospect, because exactly what would he have done? This was a completely empty threat. There is no way Sanji is shooting a woman, no matter how threatening she is. It's crazy how Oda made me feel for Sentomaru, despite him barely even being a tertiary character. So Oda is probably the world's leading expert on getting you to feel a certain way towards any given character as quickly as possible. I talk about this quite a bit in my videos on minor villains, and especially when I examine St. Charlos, because it's actually stunning just how efficient Oda is with these kind of characters. Within 2 pages of St. Charlos being introduced, he immediately becomes the most hated character in the series to that point, which with Charlos, Bellamy, Helmeppo, and all of the others, Oda does very efficiently by making them as unrelatable as possible. But he can do the same for the opposite feeling, which is what he did with little Sentomaru here. Oda just had to hit a couple of key beats to make Sentomaru relatable. And one of the classic Oda story tools is hunger. Every person in this world can relate to being hungry, so seeing the adorable little Sentomaru being insanely excited over food does a lot to endear him to us. And also, hunger can be used in reverse, because you compare that to say Helmeppo's introduction, where he's deliberately wasting Rika's food, and because everyone can relate to hunger, instantly he becomes the greatest scum in the world. So much so that in the live action adaptation, he was unceremoniously stripped with nothing but a teddy bear to cover his assorted Helmeppo bits. And speaking of bears, something I didn't notice at first is the bear connection. And we're back to talking about Sentomaru now, by the way. Sentomaru brings order to an island full of super strong rabid bears. Then Vegapunk employs him as a bodyguard, and what goes on to become his primary duty? To oversee a series of cyborgs all based on a bear man. And it's little things like that that I love about about One Piece. It could have been any animal: wolves, alligators, lions, gorillas, others. I'm sure there are others. But it wasn't. Oda deliberately chose bears because it was thematically appropriate. Sentomaru's defense is like Berta's speed in Dragon Ball Z. Yeah, this could not be more accurate. In Dragon Ball Z, there was a character called Berta who claimed to be the fastest person in the universe, despite the fact that he worked for at least two people who were faster, one of which was Frieza. It was a stupid claim. He was a fraud, that's what he was. And do you think what Sentomaru is doing is just trying to will something into existence, a sort of fake it till you maybe eventually make it? Perhaps if I, Sentomaru, the world's cutest bear basher, was to believe that I have the world's greatest defense so hard, then the universe will make it happen. It's a bold strategy. Let's see if it's paying off for him. No, it didn't. I don't know why I'm just now realizing this, but Kaku probably has the world record for speed running a Devil Fruit Awakening. Like, he only ate his fruit a little over 2 years ago. You know that's not wrong. Oh, mate. Am I now seriously thinking that Kaku may objectively be one of the best Devil Fruit users in the series? If not the best Devil Fruit user, just by how quickly he got to the awakening, and especially considering what he was given to work with, which was Giraffe. And you know what? I'm just gonna go out there and say it. Kaku is the best Devil Fruit user in One Piece. Feel free to prove me wrong in the comments, which I may, or more likely, may not read. Weapons left with bubbles. Yeah, I wish. Look, I should probably give up hope by now, but I won't. Everything we've discovered on this island is an absolute dream for Frankie, and I think it would be a waste not to incorporate at least something into his body. If he could find a way to insert the bubble tech, I guess like how the Mark III Pacifista can, then he could genuinely become one of the most useful Straw Hats, because he would exist as a hard counter to Devil Fruit users. But there's so many other possibilities as well. Frankie could also make use of the GP flowers, or depending on how much of his body is still actually human, maybe even find a use for the green blood. So imagine this, right? There's a world, it exists. Frankie is in it. And in this world that Frankie is in, he can just equip and unequip Devil Fruit powers casually, just by infusing the green blood in and out. First in, then out. In, out. Just keep swapping them like a multi-tool. It'll never happen, I understand this, but I can dream. I want Liam's expert opinion about the light and shadows of this chapter. Yeah, that's pretty good. I'm just finding it weird that the Seraphims can't get a new order from Vegapunk. Shouldn't they just be able to knock York out and give them new orders? So they can't do that because every Vegapunk holds the same command priority. This isn't a Sugar situation where knocking her out removes the magical fruit powers, because these are not magical fruit powers. York's orders remain until they're completed, at which point the command hierarchy resets and awaits a new order. That or someone with a higher priority changes the order. And currently the only person able to do that is Saint Saturn. And as a reminder, he can't do it by distance either. The Seraphim can't be remotely controlled. You have to give those orders in person. So at some point, he's going to have to get up off his old man ass and just take a nice day trip to the island. Did we ever figure out what that shadow creature was? No, we did not. Not yet. And rather inconveniently, or I guess quite conveniently for the story, Shaka was the only one in the monitor room at the time. He was the only one who saw the shadow creature on the monitors. And Shaka is now allegedly very, very dead. So nobody else is even aware that there's another problem. I mean, that's not quite true. Luffy was told about the problem, but giving Luffy information is always a bit unreliable. Whatever it was systematically cutting the cameras out one by one, and it is still very much an active threat. I don't think Luffy was talking about Kizaru. He was not at all concerned about Green Bull. I think he sensed the Gorosei. We know it's true. Something that doesn't quite add up here is Luffy's post-time skip response to admirals in general. And actually, conflict with Kizaru now marks the point where Luffy has, at least in some way, interacted with all three post-time skip admirals. The one he was most concerned with was Fujitora, but even then, Luffy wasn't overwhelmed by him. Meanwhile, with Green Bull, Luffy had zero concern whatsoever, and he was more treated like a training exercise for Momonosuke and the vassals. And now with Kizaru, Luffy is pretty supremely confident. So maybe, just maybe, there is something to the idea that Luffy wasn't sensing Kizaru in chapter 1090. Maybe it was Saint Saturn, or maybe it was a third figure. It would be a pretty funny twist if the Kizaru situation was solved, and then Luffy was all like, alright, now I've got to find the actually strong guy. Right now, I do think that we might be reading a bit too much into it. It's probably Kizaru because the simplest solution is most often the correct one. But you let me know in the comments. Who do you think it was that rocked Luffy to his core in chapter 1090?